Most of us were taught that the British Empire ended in a kind of dignified exhaustion. 2 world wars had drained it. Its colonies wanted their freedom, and Britain, weary and diminished, finally agreed to let them go. At midnight on the 15th of August, 1947, a flag came down over Delhi. Over the following 2 decades, dozens more came down across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. A quarter of the world's land surface changed hands. Most of it changed hands without Britain fighting a war to hold on. It is a clean story. It is a tidy story. It is the story of an empire that simply grew too old and too tired to keep going. And it is dangerously incomplete. In places, it is flat out wrong. The British Empire did not run out of soldiers. In the summer of 1945, it had more men under arms than at any moment in its history. It did not run out of territory either. On paper, the empire was physically larger in 1946 than it had been in 1936. It did not even run out of political will. What it ran out of was money. And it had been quietly running out of money for half a century before anyone in London was willing to write that sentence down on official paper. The empire was not defeated. It was foreclosed on. Let me say that again, because it matters. The largest empire in human history was not ended primarily by rebellion or by invasion or by a moral awakening in the corridors of Westminster. It was ended by its own balance sheet. The decisive blows were struck not by revolutionaries but by creditors. And the most important of those creditors was not an enemy at all. It was Britain's closest friend. I am not here to tell you that the men who dismantled the empire were fools, or that the men who tried to hold it together were villains. What happened is stranger and more uncomfortable than that. Britain built a global system that worked brilliantly for as long as one particular set of financial flows kept moving in one particular direction. When those flows reversed, and they began reversing long before the first shot of the First World War, the empire became a machine that consumed more than it produced. Everything after that was liquidation, conducted slowly at first, then all at once. By the end of this, you will know why a Treasury official almost nobody remembers wrote the memorandum that helped kill the British coal industry. You will know about a dinner party in London in March of 1925, where the most consequential economic decision of the British century was argued out across a table, and about the guest who told the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to his face, that the decision would be hell. You will know why India, supposedly the empire's greatest asset, finished the Second World War as Britain's largest creditor. You will know what was said down a telephone line to London in November of 1956 that ended a British invasion in days without an American firing a shot. And you will know why the last payment on the loan that kept Britain standing after 1945 was not made until the final days of 2006, long after the empire it was meant to preserve had ceased to exist. So let's go back, not to 1947, and not to the trenches. Let's go back to a set of ledgers kept in London in the middle of the 19th century, in which the earnings of one country were quietly used to settle the debts of another. Here is the thing about the British Empire that almost never survives the trip into a school textbook. Britain did not, for most of the imperial century, sell more goods to the world than it bought. From roughly the 1850s onward, Britain ran a persistent deficit in physical trade. It imported American wheat, Argentine beef, Danish butter, Egyptian cotton, Malayan rubber, and Australian wool, and the value of all that coming in exceeded the value of the cloth and machinery and ships going out. A country that buys more than it sells has to settle the difference somehow. Britain settled it with what economists then called invisibles. Shipping fees, because British ships carried much of world trade. Insurance premiums, because Lloyd's insured it. Banking commissions, because the bills of exchange that financed a cargo of Brazilian coffee to Hamburg were very often drawn on a London bank. And above all, income from investments abroad. That last one is the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. By 1913, British investors held something in the order of £4 billion of assets overseas. To translate that, it was roughly 1.5 times everything Britain produced in a year, and close to 2/5 of all the foreign investment in the world. The annual income streaming back from those holdings ran to around £200 million. That was about 1/10 of national income arriving every year from ownership rather than from work. So the empire was not really a business that made things and sold them. By the late Victorian period, the empire was a rentier, a landlord with tenants on 6 continents, and its true product was not steel or cotton. It was trust. Trust that a bill drawn in London would be honored. Trust that the pound was as good as gold, because it was convertible into gold at a fixed price. Sterling was not merely British money. It was the world's money, and the profits of being the world's banker paid for the fleet that guarded the world's trade routes, which was why everyone trusted sterling. It was an elegant circle, It was also a circle that depended on one hidden subsidy. That subsidy came from India. Here is where the story gets strange. India is usually taught as the jewel in the crown, a phrase that suggests ornament, prestige, something admired rather than something used. India was not ornamental. India was the plumbing. Every year, the government of India was required to remit a sum of money to London, known officially as the home charges. These were the costs of being governed by Britain, billed to the governed, interest on debt that India had been made to assume, pensions for British officials who had served in India and retired to Surrey, the upkeep of the India Office, and a very large share of the cost of the Indian Army, an army Britain deployed well beyond India, in China, in Persia, in East Africa. By the turn of the 20th century, the home charges ran to somewhere between 16 and 20 million pounds a year, every year, in one direction only. The mechanism was ingenious enough that most people who lived under it never saw it working. The India Office in London would sell what were called council bills to merchants who wanted to buy Indian goods. Those merchants paid in sterling in London. The bills were then presented in Calcutta or Bombay and redeemed in rupees out of Indian tax revenue. So Indian exporters were paid in Indian money raised from Indian taxes, while the gold and hard currency the world paid for Indian jute, tea, cotton, and opium never left London. India, meanwhile, ran a large trade surplus with the rest of the world, selling far more to Europe, America, and East Asia than it bought. Under any ordinary arrangement, that surplus would have accumulated in India as gold and reserves. Instead, it was captured in London and used to settle Britain's deficits with everyone else. India's surplus paid for Britain's shortfall. That is not a metaphor. That is bookkeeping. The first man to lay this out in public with numbers was not a British radical. He was an Indian merchant, professor, and eventually a member of the British Parliament, named Dadabhai Naoroji. Beginning in the 1860s and culminating in his 1901 book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, Naoroji argued that a steady one-way transfer, which he called the drain, was extracting the surplus of a poor country to underwrite the comfort of a rich one. He framed it as un-British conduct, an appeal to Britain's own stated principles. He was essentially right about the direction of the flow, if not always about its size. Modern scholarship has fought over the size of that transfer ever since. The economist Utsa Patnaik has published estimates running to tens of trillions of dollars in today's money. Other economic historians, notably Tirthankar Roy, argue that those numbers rest on compounding assumptions that inflate them dramatically, and that a substantial share of the home charges bought India real things: railways, ports, irrigation, works. The argument is about magnitude. Almost nobody disputes the direction, and the direction is what matters here. Because a system built on a one-way flow has one catastrophic vulnerability. It only works while the flow goes one way. Now, let's talk about something the conventional narrative gets badly wrong. The standard account holds that Britain declined because its factories fell behind Germany and America. That is true, as far as it goes. Britain's share of world manufacturing output fell from around a fifth in 1880 to a little over a tenth by 1913, while the American share climbed past a third. But describing that as Britain falling behind implies an accident, a stumble, a failure of energy. It was not an accident. It was a choice, made thousands of times, by people acting rationally on the incentives in front of them. Between 1,870 and 1,913, British savers exported capital on a scale no country has matched before or since. In some years, more than half of all British savings went abroad. The money built railways across the Argentine pampas, tramways in Rio, gold mines on the Rand, cattle ranches in Texas, and rather a lot of the American steel industry. What it did not build, in anything like the same proportion, was modern plant in Lancashire, or new steel capacity in Sheffield, or electrical engineering firms in the Midlands to compete with Siemens. Why would it? A bond issued by a colonial government carried an implicit imperial guarantee and paid better than a domestic industrial share. The City of London was superbly organized to place foreign securities and comparatively uninterested in financing a Bradford textile firm's re-equipment. A gentleman with capital did not put it into a factory. He put it into paper, and paper paid. The historians Peter Kane and Anthony Hopkins gave this pattern its most influential name in their two-volume work, British Imperialism, first published in the late 1980s. They called it gentlemanly capitalism, and their argument was that the driving force of British expansion was never really the industrial north at all. It was an alliance of the City of London, the financial services around it, and the landed and professional elite whose sons ran the colonial service. Empire served the interests of finance far more consistently than it served the interests of manufacturing. The thesis has been attacked from several directions, and it should be Critics note that it underplays provincial industrial lobbies, and that many colonies were acquired for reasons that had little to do with the city's balance sheet. But the core observation is hard to dislodge because it is visible in the capital account. There is a companion finding that is even more uncomfortable. In 1986, two American economic historians, Lance Davis and Robert Huttenbach, published a systematic audit of imperial returns titled Mammon and the Pursuit of Empire. They asked a simple question: did the empire pay? It paid handsomely for a narrow group of investors, they concluded, while the costs, principally the defense budget that made it possible, fell on the general British taxpayer. Empire, on their reading, was a transfer from the British middle class to the British elite. Patrick O'Brien reached a similar conclusion about the size of that defense subsidy. Deirdre McCloskey has pushed back hard on the wider declinist story, arguing that Victorian investors were allocating capital perfectly sensibly. What is not in doubt is that Britain entered the 20th century with a magnificent portfolio and an aging industrial base. Then came the war that turned the portfolio into cash. Britain entered the First World War as the world's largest creditor nation. It left the war as a debtor, and the transformation took barely 4 years. The mechanism was brutally simple. Modern industrial war had to be paid for in American dollars because the shells, the steel, the wheat, and the machine tools increasingly came from America. Britain did not have those dollars. So it taxed, it borrowed at home, and when those ran short, it began requisitioning the private overseas securities of its own citizens and selling them in New York. British holders were compelled to hand over American railway bonds and industrial shares, which were liquidated for dollars. Roughly a quarter of Britain's American holdings went that way. The savings of 2 generations, the very portfolio that had made Britain the world's rentier, was fed into the machine in 18 months. When the securities ran low, Britain borrowed, mainly through the House of Morgan, which acted as purchasing agent and banker for the Allies in the United States. By late 1916, the position was frightening. Britain was spending enormous sums in America every week and covering a large share of it with short-term credit. On the 28th of November, 1916, the Federal Reserve Board issued a warning to American banks about holding too much foreign short-term paper. It was not a declaration, it was a note of caution. Sterling wobbled immediately, and the Treasury understood exactly what it meant. The empire's ability to keep fighting now depended on the opinion of American bankers. American entry into the war in April of 1917 relieved the pressure by replacing private credit with government credit. It did not remove the debt, it moved the creditor from Wall Street to the United States Treasury. By the armistice, Britain owed the American government something in the region of $4.5 billion. British national debt had risen from about £650 million in 1914 to over $7 billion by 1919, which is to say from a manageable fraction of national output to well beyond a full year of it. One document from this period tells you everything about the mood in London. In 1922, the Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, sent a note to the Allied governments proposing that Britain would collect from its debtors only what it needed to pay its own creditor in Washington. It was meant to sound magnanimous. What it announced to the world was that the empire's finances now had an American ceiling. And here we arrive at the dinner party. In the spring of 1925, Britain faced a decision everyone involved understood to be historic. Sterling had left the gold standard during the war. The question was whether to go back, and at what rate. Returning at the old pre-war parity of $4.86 to the pound would restore the city's prestige and confirm that a promise made in London was a promise kept. It would also, by common estimate, leave the pound overvalued by around 10%, which meant every British export was 10% harder to sell. The governor of the Bank of England was Montague Norman, and he is the figure at the center of this story that most people have never heard of. Norman ran the bank from 1920 to 1944, an extraordinary 24 years. He was secretive, mystical, and physically frail. He traveled to America under the assumed name of Professor Clarence Skinner to avoid the press. He suffered repeated nervous collapses. And he believed, with something close to religious conviction, that restoring the gold standard was a moral obligation, and the alternative, a slide into national dishonor. Norman had an ally inside the Treasury named Otto Niemeyer, the Controller of Finance, who had come first in the civil service examination the year Keynes came second. Niemeyer wrote the crucial official memorandum arguing for return at the old parity. His case was not stupid. He argued that credit, once broken, cannot be cheaply repaired, and that a currency the world could not rely on would cost Britain more in the long run than an overvalued one cost its exporters in the short run. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was Winston Churchill, who was not an economist and knew it. He circulated a skeptical memorandum of his own, asking why a policy that made finance content should make industry suffer. And on the 17th of March, 1925, he did something remarkable. He invited both sides to dinner at number 11 Downing Street and made them argue it out in front of him. On one side sat Niemeyer and the bank's position. On the other sat John Maynard Keynes, who said the overvaluation would force British wages down through unemployment rather than through agreement, and Reginald McKenna, a former Chancellor turned banker. Late in the evening, Churchill turned to McKenna and asked him directly what he would do. McKenna's answer has been quoted ever since, because it is one of the most honest sentences ever spoken by a man in that room. "There is no escape," he said. "You have to go back. But the decision will be hell." Churchill went back. He announced the return to gold in his budget speech of April 1925. The consequences arrived exactly where Keynes said they would. Coal, still Britain's largest export industry, was hit first and hardest. Owners demanded longer hours and lower wages to close the gap the exchange rate had opened. The miners refused. In May of 1926, the Trades Union Congress called a general strike, and for 9 days, close to 2 million workers stopped work. Keynes had already published a pamphlet with a title that dispensed with diplomacy, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. Read that sequence again, because it is the empire in miniature. To protect the position of London as the world's banker, Britain adopted an exchange rate that damaged the industries that had made it worth banking with. The financial layer was defended at the expense of the productive layer beneath it. Britain abandoned gold anyway on the 21st of September, 1931, after a run on the pound and, of all things, a protest by naval ratings at Invergordon over pay cuts. Out of the wreckage came the sterling area, a block of countries that held their reserves in London and traded in pounds. It looked like the empire consolidating. It was the empire retreating into a currency zone because it could no longer compete in an open one. Then came the Second War, and with it the liquidation. In 1939, in an operation eventually codenamed Fish, Britain began shipping its gold reserves and privately held securities across the Atlantic to Canada for safekeeping, and more to the point, for sale. Warships carried bullion in crates through submarine-infested water. The purpose was not merely to keep the gold from Hitler. It was to have it where it could be turned into dollars. By the winter of 1940, the dollars were nearly gone. Under American law, and specifically the Neutrality Acts, Britain had to pay cash for what it bought. In March of 1941, at Washington's insistence, Britain sold the American Viscose Corporation, the highly profitable American subsidiary of the textile firm Courtaulds, for about $54 million. It was worth, by most contemporary estimates, well over twice that. It caused an uproar in the House of Commons that summer, because everyone could see what it was. It was a demonstration that Britain would be made to sell the family silver before it was helped. Lend-Lease, signed that same month, ended the immediate crisis and eventually delivered some $31 billion of supplies to Britain. It was, by any measure, an act of extraordinary American generosity. It also came with Article 7, a clause in the 1942 Mutual Aid Agreement committing Britain to work toward the elimination of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. In plain language, that meant dismantling imperial preference, the tariff system that gave empire goods privileged access to empire markets. The economic scaffolding of the empire was written out of existence in a subordinate clause of a wartime aid agreement. And while all this was happening, the ledger that had held the whole structure up quietly ran backwards. To fight the war in Asia, Britain bought vast quantities of Indian goods and Indian services and paid for almost none of them in cash. Instead, it credited India with sterling balances held in London, essentially an IOU. By 1945, total sterling balances owed by Britain around the world stood at roughly £3.5 billion. India alone held about $1.33 billion of that. Consider what that means. For 80 years, India had been the mechanism that settled Britain's deficits. Now India was Britain's largest creditor. The subsidy had not merely stopped, it had inverted. The empire's most valuable possession had become its biggest bill. Keynes, by then advising the Treasury, wrote a memorandum in August of 1945 describing what Britain faced as a financial Dunkirk. Days later, 6 days after the Japanese surrender, President Truman abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. Britain had no dollars, an industrial base configured for war, a global garrison to feed, and a bombed-out country to rebuild. So Keynes was sent to Washington to ask for a gift. He came home with a loan. Britain received $3.75 billion at 2% interest, plus a further $1.25 billion from Canada. Attached was a condition. Within 1 year of the agreement coming into force, sterling had to be made convertible, meaning anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars on demand. Keynes defended the terms in the House of Lords in December of 1945, exhausted and ill. He died the following April at 62. Convertibility took effect on the 15th of July, 1947. Holders of sterling around the world did precisely what anyone could have predicted. They converted. Britain's reserves drained at a catastrophic pace, roughly $1 billion in about 5 weeks, and on the 20th of August, convertibility was suspended. Now look at the calendar. Convertibility opened on the 15th of July, 1947. India and Pakistan became independent on the 15th of August, 1947. The financial crisis and the transfer of power in South Asia occupied the same 5 weeks. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a conspiracy. It is the same underlying fact appearing in 2 places at once. A country that cannot defend its own currency for 5 weeks cannot administer a subcontinent. In September of 1949, the pound was devalued from $4.03 to $2.80, a cut of over 30%. The world's money had been marked down by a third, and then, 7 years later, came the demonstration. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal Company. Britain and France, with Israel, moved militarily to take it back. The invasion was, in narrow military terms, going well. British paratroopers landed on the 5th of November. Within 24 hours, the operation was over. What stopped it was not the Egyptian army and not the Soviet Union. It was the American Treasury. Sterling came under heavy selling pressure, some of it from the American authorities themselves. Britain's reserves fell by around $280 million in November alone, roughly a seventh of everything it had. Britain applied to the International Monetary Fund for a standby credit of over $500 million. Washington made clear that it would block the drawing and would not support the pound while British troops remained in Egypt. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, among the most enthusiastic supporters of the operation, reversed within days. A colleague later described him as first in, first out. The ceasefire came on the 6th of November. An empire that still governed tens of millions of people was stopped in under a week by a threat to its exchange rate. No shot was fired at Britain by the power that defeated it. Suez is usually taught as a political humiliation, a moment when Britain misjudged the mood of the age. It was something much simpler and much colder. It was a margin call. Now, let's talk about how historians have fought over all this, because the argument has been fierce and the names are worth knowing. The original account was written, in effect, by the people who carried out the policy. The official version, embodied in the great published series on the transfer of power, presented decolonization as a planned and principled process. Britain had always intended to prepare its colonies for self-government. The wars merely accelerated a timetable that already existed. Empire ended, in this telling, because it succeeded. The first serious demolition came in 1953, when 2 Cambridge historians, John Gallagher and Ronald Robinson, published an article called The Imperialism of Free Trade. Historians, they argued, had been counting the wrong thing. Formal empire, the pink areas on the map, was only the visible portion. Britain exercised comparable power over Argentina, over China's treaty ports, over Egypt before 1882, through trade, debt, and the threat of the fleet, without governing them at all. They followed it in 1961, with Africa and the Victorians, which argued that the scramble for Africa was driven less by greed in London than by crises on the periphery and by what they called the official mind. Robinson and Gallagher have been criticized for the reverse of the usual failing. By making informal influence so central, they made imperialism a category almost too broad to falsify. But they permanently changed the question. After 1953, you could not seriously study the empire by looking only at the map. The economic turn came later. Kane and Hopkins put the city at the center. Davis and Huttenbach put a price on the whole enterprise and found the taxpayers subsidizing the investor. And in 2009, John Darwin, in the Empire Project, offered the most persuasive synthesis: that the British world system was not a monolith, but a working arrangement of credit, shipping, migration, naval power, and local collaboration, which did not so much collapse as lose the financial keystone holding the other pieces in tension. Meanwhile, a separate quarrel raged over what Britain did after the empire. In 1986, Corelli Barnett published The Audit of War, arguing that Britain squandered the moment of victory by building a welfare state on borrowed money instead of rebuilding its industry. It was a bestseller, and it enraged an entire scholarly field. Jim Tomlinson and others have argued that Barnett's declinism is a myth built on selective comparison, that British post-war growth was historically strong, and that the welfare state was not the reason exporters struggled. David Edgerton has gone further, arguing in The Rise and Fall of the British Nation that we overrate how much the empire mattered to Britain's economy. I find Edgerton's challenge genuinely difficult, and I want to leave it standing rather than knock it over. But notice that even the most skeptical version concedes the central point. Whether the empire was worth a great deal, or rather less than we imagined, the moment it stopped being able to finance itself was the moment it stopped existing. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because separately each of them is an ordinary problem, and together they are an ending. You had a financial system in London superbly designed to send savings abroad and poorly designed to modernize industry at home. You had a hidden subsidy flowing out of India every year that quietly balanced Britain's books and that no British voter ever had to approve. You had a war from 1914 to 1918 that consumed the overseas portfolio, converted the world's largest creditor into an American debtor, and put a ceiling on British policy priced in dollars. You had a decision in 1925 to defend the prestige of the currency at the direct expense of the export industries, followed by a general strike and a decade of stagnation in the old industrial regions. You had a second war that forced the sale of the remaining assets, wrote imperial preference out of existence in a clause of an aid agreement, and reversed the Indian ledger so completely that the colony became the creditor. You had a loan in 1946 whose conditions produced a currency crisis in the very month of Indian independence. You had a demonstration at Suez in 1956 that the empire's foreign policy now required American permission, expressed not through diplomacy but through the reserves. Any one of these produces a difficult decade. Any two produce a crisis. All of them together, arriving in sequence over 70 years, produce a liquidation. And here is the part that should unsettle you. Almost every step was taken by intelligent men, for defensible reasons, in defense of something they genuinely believed was worth defending. They were not evil, they were solvent right up until they were not. Let me take you down from the ledgers now, because there is a cost in this story that is not measured in pounds. In 1943, in the province of Bengal, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people died in a famine. The wartime economy is inseparable from what happened. Rice imports from Burma had been cut off by the Japanese advance. Boats were confiscated in coastal districts under denial policies. And critically, the government was financing the war effort in India by printing money, which set off severe inflation in a province where millions of landless laborers bought their food daily at market prices. The economist Amartya Sen's study of the famine, published in 1981, argued that the collapse was not primarily about the total quantity of food in Bengal. It was about who could still afford to buy it. Think about what that means at the level of a single household. A man who cut rice for a landlord earned the same few annas a day he had earned the year before. The price of the rice he cut had tripled. Nothing had been taken from him that he could point to. No soldier came to his door. His wage simply stopped reaching across the gap to the food, and he starved inside a functioning market in a province still exporting. Requests from Delhi for grain shipments were refused or reduced in London on the grounds of shipping shortages, a decision historians still argue about bitterly. However you apportion the responsibility, the mechanism at the center was monetary. The war was paid for with inflation, and the inflation was paid for with lives. And on the other side of the ledger, in Britain itself, the reckoning arrived in a milder but very visible form. Bread was never rationed during the war. It was rationed in July of 1946, after victory, because Britain could not afford the dollars to buy North American wheat. In February of 1947, the coldest winter in living memory froze the coal at the pitheads, industry shut down, and millions were laid off in a country that had just won a world war. Families queued in the snow outside shops that had less to sell than they had during the Blitz. That is what an empire looks like from inside when it can no longer pay. Not a flag coming down in a distant capital. A ration book for bread in the country that supposedly won. I want to be careful in what I say next, because it is easy to draw the wrong lesson from all of this. Every era has a country whose currency the world holds, whose debts the world buys, and whose military presence the world quietly assumes. That position is enormously profitable. It lets a nation buy more than it sells, year after year, and settle the difference by issuing paper that foreigners are happy to hold. Britain enjoyed that privilege for roughly a century, and the thing Britain learned, slowly and expensively, is that the privilege is not a possession. It is a reputation, and reputations are financed. Notice which weapon actually ended the British Empire's freedom of action. Not tanks. A refusal to lend, and a threat to sell a currency. Financial power was the decisive instrument of the 20th century, and it is being used more openly today than at any time since. Notice, too, the pattern that hollowed Britain out from within. Capital that finds it more profitable to buy assets than to build capacity, an economy that grows very good at finance while its industrial regions fall behind, and a political class that measures national health by the strength of the currency rather than by what the country can actually make. Notice finally how long the appearance of strength outlasted the substance of it. The Royal Navy was still enormous in 1956. The map was still pink in a great many places. The reserves were the only thing that had changed, and the reserves turned out to be the only thing that mattered. None of that is unique to Britain, and none of it is confined to the past. I am not going to tell you which country I have in mind. You can do that arithmetic yourself. The next time someone tells you that the British Empire ended because the world changed its mind about colonialism, you'll know better. The world's mind was changing, and that mattered, and the people who fought for their independence earned it. But the reason Britain could not resist was written down long before in ledgers kept in London, in council bills drawn on Calcutta, in securities sold in New York in 1916, in an exchange rate chosen at a dinner table in 1925, in a corporation sold at a discount in 1941, and in a phone call about reserves in 1956. The empire was not overthrown, it was audited, and it did not pass. Follow the money, and the collapse stops looking like fate. It starts looking like a series of choices, each one defensible, that together added up to an ending nobody chose. If you want more history told this way, through the ledgers rather than around them, subscribe, because that is the only thing this channel does. And I want to hear from you on one specific question. Of everything we covered, which one do you think was the true point of no return? The drain from India? The export of capital instead of investment at home? The securities sold in 1916? The return to gold in 1925? Or the loan of 1,946? Pick one and tell me why in the comments. I read every single one of them. And if this changed how you see the map on your classroom wall, a like genuinely helps other people find it.